Hello. Today's video practice. And for some reason I have decided that I'm going to talk about what I'm reading at the moment, which is a bit of a mistake because it's a super complicated book. So the book's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is a weird title for a book, but it is a classic if you've never heard of it. And this is the second time I'm reading it. I read it years ago, and the only thing I really remember about it was that it left sort of intrinsic impression at the time, and for some reason I've forgotten most of the content. I'm not finished through this time, I'm only a third of the way through, but there's so much in there that it's worth talking about. Especially at this stage in the book, the big discussion is on something which I think is really valuable to the modern day, and is also a topic which keeps on coming up in my conversations as well at the moment, which is like the crossover between different ways of thinking. And I've had a couple of conversations recently where people have thought that there's just no crossover possible within some different fields, different ways of thinking. I think of one particular conversation from a historian friend of mine who wrote an article about how no matter how hard the multi what's that phrase? When two fields come together and try multidisciplinary work, that's what I'm looking for. Multidisciplinary work between historians and archaeologists is never going to work because their frame of thought is different. What they're looking for is different, despite the fact that they both are interested in history. And I remember this striking me as very odd that this friend argued so aggressively that there would never ever be any crossover. And this is kind of the topic in the first third of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance as well, but in a wider sense. So it splits the whole of thinking into two key groups, which in the book get split into what the writer calls classical understanding, and then the other is called romantic understanding, where romantic understanding is about immediate understanding, how you immediately connect with the world. There's a much more emotional way of thinking, and sort of the way that you would expect an artist to think. So seeing the beauty in now, or the way that a musician might work when they're completely in mid-flow. And then this idea of classical understanding is more like the scientist or the analyst, the mathematician, where, in the words of the author, a classical thinker is concerned with the underlying form of something. This is a really interesting idea in itself, because I think a lot of people like to think of science as looking for truth, looking for universal truths. It's always one of the ideas that the theoretical physicists always talk about, isn't it? And looking for some kind of universal theorem that applies to everything and makes everything make sense. But in this book, and I agree with this, when you take on this ultra-logical way of exploring things, all you do is really split everything into different components, and you end up with a large collection of different units of analysis. This is what one of the most common phrases in my master's degree was, what are your units of analysis? But when you think about it, you're just placing the entire world into little boxes and little forms. Plato talked about this when he was talking about perfect forms. Regardless of whether there is a perfect form of everything, that is how science works, that you decide on a unit of analysis. And really, in everyday thinking, it's kind of how we're forced to think as well. I am currently sat on a tree, but what told me that I should first and foremost consider this a tree rather than a collection of trees? Or why can't I consider it in terms of its components? Like, why am I sitting on a tree and not sitting on bark? That kind of thing. Or sitting on a branch. I've decided that the most important thing is that I'm sitting on a tree, which is a relatively wide unit of analysis. But the point there is, what we tend to consider as truths are actually abstractions. And that is actually what is valued at the moment in terms of knowledge, in terms of skills. Like, I'm thinking a lot about jobs at the moment, like I said in the previous video. And then that is declared a truth. That makes me think of a conversation I had with a mathematician friend a few months ago. We asked him, what is it about maths which is so interesting to him? He's a PhD mathematician, so he's put a lot of time into this. And he thought about it, and his answer was, the great thing about maths is that it's one of the only fields that allow you to look at ultimate truths. Now there you go again, there's that word truth, but here he's put in the term ultimate truth. Because mathematicians, I think, are more aware than many scientists that things are not as objective as they seem. But in maths, you kind of can't have something that isn't objective. You could redefine your bases and things. You can redefine the way that you calculate things, but maths is really a process. And I'm not a mathematician, so I'm not going to be able to explain that in the right vocab or anything. But the thing is, when you actually find some way of thinking that you can actually claim, yeah, this is a truth, you have to start asking what that actually means. So, for example, I'm just going to use very crude, basic stuff here because it makes it easy to communicate, and I'm not a mathematical genius. Now, if I say 1 = 1, it's obviously true. But what does it mean? Or, like, a circle has no sides. Awesome, that's really cool. But what does it mean? Maths becomes valuable when you apply it to something, and as soon as you apply it to something, you're modeling something, and the truth is gone. So something simply being truthful in itself is kind of meaningless. That's kind of the weird but big thought process that I've got recently from reading this book. If you start off with this realization that what we like to consider as being the best kind of knowledge in many ways, or the valuable kind of knowledge, is only valuable because we apply it to more qualitative concepts. In the end, it's just a tool, and the more that you try and separate that from a more emotional connection, a more social connection, then it becomes less and less valuable. And yet, in this book, it's trying to talk about how these ideas are completely inseparable, but they're not. And my historian friend who tried to claim that these two fields of history and archaeology were completely, they didn't have anything in common. It's rubbish. They just haven't worked out how to connect them. There's too much of a connection to these units of analysis. And, I said earlier it was Plato that talked about this idea of forms. So, philosophically, it's been around for a long, long time, thousands and thousands of years. And it's almost a trap. It's valuable, it helps us understand a lot of things, but it also separates us from an actual connection with what's around us, and potentially, I think, also a connection with other people. There's my thinking today on, stemming from an interesting and challenging book. Right, oh, that's 10 minutes already, so I think that's a good time to stop.